Robert Dahl's book, How Democratic is the American Constitution, is an excellent example of how an excellent political scientist thinks. Here are some of the things that you should pay attention when you're reading the book, not just to the content of the book, and I'll say a few words about that, but to the structure and style of the book. What Professor Dahl does is he structures his book as a series of interesting and important questions about the American Constitution. Now, the questions that he raises take two main kinds of forms. And political scientists, in fact, any sort of social science researcher, will often use one or both of these forms, so I want to make sure that we can clearly distinguish between them. The first kind of question is an empirical question, or sometimes it's called a positive question. And what we mean by an empirical question is it is a question that can be answered by an appeal to evidence. Now, sometimes that evidence will be definitive, so we can conclude that the answer is right or wrong, that the hypothesis is supported or not supported. Sometimes the evidence is not quite so clear, so we might think that a question or a statement is generally true or generally false, but there can be exceptions to that. Human life is complicated after all. But at any rate, empirical questions can be answered by an appeal to evidence. And Dahl raises a number of those questions, and I'll mention one of them in a minute. The second kind of question that political scientists use are called normative questions. And normative questions don't ask how the world is. They don't make appeals to understanding reality. A normative question is a question about what the world should be like. And whenever you ask questions about what should we do as a society, what should we do in politics, what should our Constitution look like, those questions cannot be answered definitively. There can be stronger and weaker answers based on logic, based on reason, based on appeals to human intellect, but those questions cannot be answered definitively. And Dahl also poses some normative questions in his book. Okay. So the first thing I like about his book, his work as a political scientist, is he asks interesting and important normative and positive questions. The second thing I like about his book is he takes reasonable steps to answer them and describes what he is doing to answer them. Now, political scientists try to provide evidence to answer positive questions, empirical questions, and those answers can be based on qualitative information or they can be based on quantitative information. That is, for example, we can think about trying to answer questions by doing interviews and case studies or by doing statistical models. Dahl in this book does a little bit of both, not anything fancy statistically, but he does try to bring numerical evidence to bear on his questions when possible. And throughout he tries in different ways to think about what kind of evidence would be sufficient to answer the questions he poses. So he asks interesting questions, he takes reasonable steps to answer them, things that you'll be doing when you create your digital portfolio or your video for the end of the semester. And the third thing I really like about his work as a political scientist is that he does not typically rely on jargon, complicated phrasing, obscure language, that he writes simply and directly as possible. This is an important book, an influential book, but it's also a fairly brief book, so he writes directly and to the point. So, I think it's a good example of what the best political scientists can do. Let me talk about just two questions that he poses. One is really the positive question, the empirical question, and then there's one that's more normative. I think he provides a good answer to the empirical question. It's the first question he poses, which is, how democratic is the American Constitution? Now, to answer that question, you do have to define what you mean by democratic. And what Dahl means is a society is democratic, a political system is democratic to the extent that it's one person, one vote, that is, voting rights are widespread, that each person has equal weight in making political decisions, and that then we make decisions through voting and the majority rules. It's a pretty straightforward definition of democracy. One person, one vote, majority rules. It may not be the perfect system, but that's how Dahl is defining what he means by a democratic system. And he then asks us to look at our Constitution and say, based on that democratic standard, how democratic are we? And his answer is, Not very much, at least not through the Constitution. For example, it originally allowed slavery, entirely undemocratic. It had very narrowly limited voting rights. It had an indirect election of the president, indirect election of the senators. It gave the Senate more weight than it should be because each state is counted equally rather than based on the population. Too much power to the judiciary. After all, we don't elect the judges, the Supreme Court, and they serve for life. And finally, that the Congress is given too little power for a democratic system. So, based on his standard, he finds a number of ways that the Constitution falls short. Okay? Now, his sort of normative question is, his normative argument, really, it's less of a question for him, is that our Constitution should be more democratic. Now, many of you may support that, many of you may oppose that. There's reasonable debate on the normative question. But he believes that we should make the Constitution more democratic by eliminating the flaws that we see in the Constitution. We've already limited slavery, we've broadened voting rights, but he believes that we should get rid of the Electoral College and have direct election of the president, that we should restructure the Senate so it is based on population and not based on the states, that we should reduce judicial power, and that we should increase congressional power. Okay? I think it's worth thinking about those things. Americans tend to almost worship the Constitution. He says we should ask questions about it, we should understand what it does well and what it does poorly, and in his view, when it does things poorly, it's our obligation to change it.